So we're sort of looking at end caps here, and there's lots of different variety of end caps that you could think about using. These are sort of convex or concave end caps. These ones are sort of inspired by a particular type of brush. These are a little bit more round end caps, though I didn't do a very good job of rounding these. There we go, a little bit better. So those are different ways that you can interact with the ending of your letters. And then most of these sources of inspiration are, no, you're good, you're good. Most of these are having a really nice connection to the inspiration that we're going for. Look at these end caps. This is very flourish, which is really nice. Another resource this is great for, this is the Typism Community, is to find inspiration for different finishing ways or sort of ways of finishing your work as well. So we're making progress towards just defining our form first and our shapes first. But you can also find some really great ways that you might be able to compose your pieces. Like this one, for instance, the lettering is sort of creating the mask shape. But I love this interaction of the texture that's included in here. And such an awesome way that they're going through and sort of correcting their pieces. So of course, we're working on form first, but finding inspiration for things that you'd like to try or be interested in trying as a part of our process, that'd be really awesome. We're going to end up in Photoshop, by the way, primarily working in Illustrator so far to just define forms, because I think that's a great way to do it. But you can find all kinds of things. I love the 3D of this. Look at the texture that's included in this one. It's also sort of made to look like its end caps are actually, the little plastic pieces on the shoes, which is great. I mean, I love that. It's got such a wide thickness to it, which really gives it a lot of character. And this is sort of the similar calligraphically inspired lettering that we're going to, which is pretty great. So I highly recommend checking out this resource. I think you can get tons of inspiration for different ways that you could finish your work or working on your letter forms. And I'm doing this in advance. I don't know how far you all are with your work process. I primarily have just sort of 3 letters that I think are pretty well finished. And I'm starting to make some of my guide blocks that I'm using to be able to define my thicknesses and my end caps, which I think is a great way to think about this as well. So Typism, great resource. Anywhere you can find inspiration for type is great, but check that one out. See if you can get some inspiration. I recommend, sort of taking breaks throughout your process to look for inspiration. When you're going back and forth, start with some inspiration, work for a while, and then go back to it and sort of adjust your work as you go, which is pretty great. Okay. A couple of things I wanted to just go over really quickly in Illustrator. If you're working in Illustrator, some of you are working in different spaces, that's perfectly fine. If you hit the Command and R tool, this is how you can create the rulers or turn the rulers on and off. If your screen doesn't look like mine, you can see that those rulers are turning on and off. When I hold down the command, if you're on a PC, it'll be the control button. So hold down the control button and hit the letter R, that will turn the rulers on and off. So to be able to create the rulers, this is a really great way to be able to measure things potentially, but also to be able to create guides for yourself. So it's going to be Command plus R or Control plus R if you're on a PC. So recommend using that. Again, just Command and R, turn those on and off. The way that these guides work, essentially, if I want to, it's just a line that goes all the way across your entire workspace, wherever you want to create those lines. To be able to create these lines, essentially, I can just click and drag on my ruler. So if you haven't used this before, go ahead and just watch me for a second. This is the ruler space, essentially. I want to be able to create a horizontal ruler. So I'm going to click and drag down from that ruler, and then just wherever I let go, will create a guide. So I can use these as a couple different things that I'm measuring within my letterings. So if I go underneath these letterings, you can see that this is a font, by the way. It's really good to study fonts. You see if I zoom in really, really close, that even if I get this line perfectly aligned to the bottom of the R, for instance, I'm zoomed in like 4,500%. Here's the alignment of those things. You can also see that those curvatures, those round letters actually sit a little bit lower. And the reason that that is because it needs to optically look like they align correctly. And if you make your rounded forms smaller than the end where that baseline is, if it fits in with that baseline, the letter itself will actually look too small. So they've corrected this font by making all the rounded edges extend further past where they should. And you can see that again also on the X height. So if this was my X height line, I can click and drag and just measure my X height across multiple letters this way. The hotkey to be able to turn on and off the rulers, if you wanted to be able to see them temporarily, but not actually the whole time, is actually also a really useful hotkey to know so that you can sort of see both with the guides and with them off. And I believe it is Command plus the colon button, or that would be Control on a PC plus the colon button. So it looks like a little winky smiley face because I put that in parentheses, but there you go. So actually I can turn these guides on and off very easily by hitting the command button and just hitting that colon or semicolon button to be able to see those guides turned on and off. So a couple things that I'm using this for when I'm looking at my lettering that I'm working on is that I know that my rounded forms need to be a little bit taller, and I want to be consistent about where my rounded forms end. So what I've done is I've created an alignment to the top of where the letters should be, but most of these are also rounded letters. So I've gone in and added an extra little guide that's sort of just an indication for me to try and get these aligned for that space as well. And it may be that I need to adjust these a little bit to make them slightly smaller potentially to fit into that space a little bit better. So those are guides. Those are really useful ways to do guides. You can do vertical guides as well by clicking and dragging on the left-hand side of the ruler to be able to create those lines or those guides. A couple places where you might want to interact with guides a little bit further. If I go to the menu that's View menu at the top of the screen and I go down to Rulers and Guides down here, there's some things that you can do to set them up. So it's sort of towards the bottom of your View menu. One of those is to unlock the guides. I think traditionally the guides are locked, which means I can't move them around. But if you unlock them, then you can. You can also click on them and delete them if you need to delete one or two. You know, if these are just sort of in the way and I don't need them, I can just click on them and delete them. But that's only after I've unlocked them. If I then also go to the guides, I can choose to clear them. There's not a hotkey for that, but I can actually go in and sort of just erase all of them for the whole document. That's another way to sort of interact with them. So I'm going to go ahead and keep these locked. I can hide or reveal those guides as I need to while I'm working on these letters. That is guides. Of course, let me know if there's any questions. I also ended up creating a slant check. So I want most of my letters to have a little bit of an angle to them. So what I've done is just created a line that has the angle that I want. So if I followed my letter here, this was sort of my introduction A. I've gone through a few stages of adjusting it, but this was kind of the angle that I wanted most of my letters to have. And I think you can see that that letter A feels like it's leaning backwards a little bit. I like that slant in there. So what I can do is just create a single line. A couple different ways you can make a line is with the pen tool. So I could just click once, move away, click somewhere else. That will make a straight edge. And then I want to give that some indication of an outline rather than a fill. So I'll just switch this color right here to be outline. I also really like this sort of teal color that the guides come in as, because I think that's very easy to see on that gray background. So I could just give that sort of a very bright blue or teal color. So that gives me an option to sort of then have this line that I've created. I can duplicate it in multiple places to sort of check the angle. So here is one where the angle of this kind of edge of the swoop of this stem was a little bit more extreme than the right-hand side. And that was something I think I adjusted on later versions of this letter, just something that I can sort of keep track of. So there, I think you can see it tucked it in just a little bit further, even if it was still fairly wide. So that gives me something to check with these letter forms, and that gives me a consistent line. And the way I keep it consistent is essentially I've only drawn it once, and I'm just making duplicate copies of that line over and over and over until I've got kind of the look or feel that I want. So I can check both the angle of the center of the A, kind of leans backwards. I can check the angle of this edge over here to sort of give it some indication that is keeping track of that angle. And then I can measure other letters as I'm going through. I've also probably put these on their own layer. If you're interested in using the layers panel, it looks sort of like this. You can have separation for guides. So anything that's a shape of a guide could be separated potentially. I could go in and sort of create a new layer if you wanted to, but most of those I was just sort of like copying and duplicating and leaving them as just free form shapes. So that was a good way to do it. And I've gone through many stages here. You know, I started off with a basic sketch. I didn't think that these had similar end caps. So this one's a little bit more round and this one's definitely more pointed. end cap. So I messed around with that later on in the process, trying to adjust for angle, trying to get a good consistency of line thickness throughout as best I can. Here's one where I've rounded it maybe even a little bit too much. So I unrounded it after I checked the scale a little bit, and I'm just making multiple copies as I go through, so it's easy to see. And then the last thing that I wanted to go over, of course, we have a checklist of some things to do, but part of our checklist that you can get into is building these little guide blocks for yourself. So these are just, squares. Essentially, this one was a square that I made by rounding a couple of the corners. So here's just like the normal square. You can see there's these little white nodes that are on the cornered edges that will allow me to make them round, but I only wanted to select 2 of those to make them round. So I actually use my direct selection tool, white arrow tool, and click and drag on those corner pieces to get those to sort of adjust. So you can use your white arrow tool, drag select over multiple points, and then round them all together. And then what I ended up doing was just turning it a little bit because my guide block, was measuring something at an angle. So these are the guide blocks that I'm using here. My letter A was the first one that I made, and that has the thicknesses determined that I kind of like how that letter was looking. This is an earlier version where I haven't adjusted the angle of this letter R as much yet. But as you can see here, this is my thickness block. So the block edge goes all the way to the thickest point in this letter and gives it a little bit of an indication, a little bit easier to read indication because it's curved on one edge. And then this one is just a tiny little rectangle. Also, I kind of curved it in a few different places. So when I'm creating my thinnest areas in the next letters or my thickest areas in the next letters, I have these blocks that I can use to guide myself. Not everything is the same thickness because I'm trying to make a little bit more of a variable font, I think. And it's mostly just the roundest part that's the thickest. So here the letter R, also the roundest part is the thickest, not necessarily the crossbar, even though this is technically a downstroke. It's not that you're trying to go to your thickest thickness everywhere. It's just where is the thickest portion of that letter. And I can sort of get inspired by that from some of my inspiration as well. So I've got some guide blocks that I'm working on using. Once I've gotten most of my letter forms constructed, and again, I'm not really sure where everyone is at. If you're still working on the majority of your letter forms, that's great. Does anyone have all of their letter forms digitally made that they wanted to? Just curious. If you want to emote for me on Zoom, or if you're here physically, is everyone sort of still working on their letter forms? I see one. Awesome job. Okay, so a couple of you may be ahead of that process, which is great. You can start taking some inspiration and things. If you're going through the checklist, if you're ready sort of for the checklist, the things to be able to adjust, this is the checklist here. And I believe we put it on Blackboard in the past, so it should be already on Blackboard in a couple different locations, I think, in the course materials. Things to check for is volume first. And actually that's something I'm trying to do by measuring the thickest areas and the thinnest areas. So these are also helping me adjust for volume. The volume of the letter should feel fairly similar through most of the letter forms, even though there are different forms. The letter R in this case, the loop goes up above the X height, but the majority of these letters are going to sit on the X and baseline. And so it's really helpful for me to be able to use these guides to measure the height first. That's definitely scale. That's one of the things on our checklist as well, but also understanding for volume. And volume is sort of like, here's the letter that takes up this amount of space. Does it feel like it's well balanced in that space? Does it feel like there's a good balance between both the form of the letter and the space around it? And in comparison to the space around the other letters. So as I'm comparing this, I would say the A maybe looks a little bit larger in volume than the R, even though the R I know is actually larger. And that might be because how thin this thin stroke is. And it might be that I need to thicken up how thin this becomes as the first extension. If I thicken it up a little bit, it might be a little bit more of a voluminous letter in this space. Although maybe I don't want it to be too overpowering since it is also scaled larger. So I need to play around with those a little bit. The E definitely needs some work on its end cap as I'm connecting it to the next letter. It should either loop way out to then connect to the next letter, or it should kick. It should sort of have a little adjustment that kicks out here. So that's something that I'm going to be working on next as I'm going through here. But those baselines and X heights and cap heights, if you're working with capital letters, is a great thing. And that is sort of looking at volume and scale. Once you have all those letters finished, you do also want to check out kerning and leading and checking for slant and thick and thins. Those are some things I've gone over already this morning. The kerning is the space between the letters. So you probably won't have to deal with leading too much if everyone's just working on a single word, although some of you are sort of stacking them, which I think is awesome. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly where this letter should be. I think if you can tell, if I move it too close to the letter R, it sort of takes up some of the space of the letter R. So that letter E is sort of invading the space and makes the R a little bit more difficult to read. So kerning is just really about legibility, and you can offset legibility by the space around the letter forms. And of course, you don't have to do these necessarily in this order. There's not like an order to these. Curves is that you're getting a consistency with your curvature. This is really a lot of times depending on if you are, just clicking a lot with your pen tool. If you're using your pen tool, if you're just clicking and moving around a lot, you're going to have a much more jagged edge, sort of more geometric edge. The curvature a lot of times is going to be using just 2 or just 3 points. So, and you're going to be clicking and dragging quite a bit to be able to get a nice curvature that way. So the fewest number of points will help you with your curvature, but you definitely don't want to have too many wiggles or bumps as you're going through. Don't want to be able to, have like these, inconsistent areas unless that's part of the style, as a part of the process for the creation of the letters. Wiggles and warps, of course, is what we were just talking about, those little bumps in areas where things are not working out. And then breakthroughs is something you want to check as well. If you need help at any point when you're finished with the majority of your letters and you want some feedback, highly recommend sending them to me so I can help you formalize your forms. And of course, if everything looks good, I'll definitely let you know so you're ready to start the next part of the process, which is going to be taking these forms into Photoshop potentially and adding in texture and lighting and color and decorative design elements in a little bit more of a free draw space now that you've defined the forms. And that's really what Illustrator is great for, is defining these forms so that we can get really solid letter shape. And that does a lot of the carrying for you. I can do just subtle textures and light and shadow that's going to make the artwork look really beautiful. Once I've spent the majority of my time kind of perfecting my forms, everything I do to them in a painter's sense is going to look good. If the forms are not really well perfected, really, whatever icing you put on the cake is not going to be a very tasty cake. So that's, I think, something to think about when you're putting those together. Definitely check that checklist. And I can pause here if anyone needs to take a screenshot of this. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to go over today for the different tips and tricks and tools. I'm going to be working on this as we go through. Happy to take time to give you guys feedback on how your stuff is working out, if you're working physically or digitally. Certainly reach out anytime. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording there.